It sure is. All right. Well, welcome to the Morgan Conservatory. I am Nicole Donnelly. I am the executive director here, and it is my pleasure to welcome Jennifer Scheuer with us today. She has been an artist in residence here for the last 4 weeks, working on a very impressive project, and our artist in residence program is supported by the Wingate Foundation. Jennifer Scheuer is a visual artist and printmaker based in Lafayette, Indiana. Scheuer is an assistant professor in the Rueff School of Design, Art, and Performance at Purdue University. She is a recipient of the 2022 DeHaan Artist of Distinction Award through the Indianapolis Arts Council. Scheuer has attended artist residencies in California, Ohio, Vermont, Virginia, Massachusetts, Canada, Poland, and Germany. Scheuer exhibits her work widely in national and international exhibitions. Scheuer received her MFA in Studio Arts, Printmaking from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and attended the Tamarind Institute Printer Training Program. Scheuer has a long-held interest in paper sculpture and book arts, and recently focused her creative practice in exploration of book arts. Her studio practice utilizes collections, archives, and research. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Scheuer.
All right, thank you all so much. Thank you, Nicole. And I want to thank again the Morgan Conservatory and the Wingate Foundation for this opportunity in artist residency. So I've been working over the past month with blowouts, which is a stencil process. And the reason I was really attracted to it is it creates like a feathery edge to the papers. And so I'll share the second half of the presentation, what I've been working in the studio. But I want to start today giving you a little background of my artistic practice. So my first experience with paper making actually was when I was a child. My father worked in an industrial paper mill, and they offered like little kits that you could bring home or like use for educational purposes. And so like our scouts troop would make paper in the studio, and I really earned the troop, and I really remember the smell of that paper pulp as well. But when I first started working with paper making, I was working with graduate school, and I was making my own paper that then I calendared and printed all of my lithographs on. I really loved the feathery edge of the paper, as well as like once you ran it through the litho machine and calendared it, it became very like soft. And so I liked the idea of like someone handling the work and the significance of the feel of the paper, which is where I directed that to. This is a piece that's been really significant to my studio practice and the evolution of my practice. A lot of my work, as mentioned, I work with in response to museums and reading historical works, talking with historians. When I was making this work at this time in 2012, I had been doing a lot of research about women's health and the history of plants that were used to treat and manage women's health, so regulating menstruation and birth control historically, and plants and healing have been a significant topic in my work. The idea that this knowledge existed throughout time, conversations of who regulated this information, and knowing that plants produce hormones and chemicals is really fascinating and powerful. Even today, there's not enough research done about women's health. So in 2012, I was a research assistant to Beauvais Lyons at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and we were creating his work in this studio. And one day we went to the McClung Museum and we looked at a bunch of works. So at the time he was making a series of works that were like hybrid animals and birds. And we were looking at Audubon books and gold books. And then we also looked at the descriptions of Egypt. And in the descriptions of Egypt was this beautiful water lily. And I really responded to this piece, and I went back to the studio and I made work like in response to those books that I was reading about the history of women's health at the time. So here, this piece is based on a story of silphium. Silphium is a plant that was hunted to extinction by the ancient Greeks because it was so effective for women's health and regulating women's health. It was so popular that it was minted on coins, and it actually looked like fennel, but it looks nothing like the illustration that I made. But I made this work in response. So I see myself kind of as a storyteller, even though it might not immediately look like that in my work, that it looks like scientific illustration perhaps. But I'm thinking about storytelling as I'm working. So here, this plant has the gesture and suggestion of fallopian tubes. You have the egg and the sperm and the root ball, and then the two little drawings on the side is kind of an implied suggestion of a bunch of fetal seeds that you see at the bottom. And then on the bottom right is this plant suspended like over a high place as if it's difficult to reach. The text on the work says, "In memory of Sylphe, favored by the ancient Greeks, reliable and effective, but often difficult to reach." I started talking with people, and then I learned that monks had medicinal gardens and physic gardens, and that they were healing based on plants and appearance. And I started researching this idea, and I finally found this phrase called the doctrine of signatures. This was an idea that was expressed in the 16th century by Paracelsus, who was an alchemist, a physician, botanist, mystic. And the theory suggested that there was an order in the world that could be observed through our eyes, that we could understand our place in the cosmos if we only knew how to look. This idea of similitude, that through observation we could heal ourselves, was a revelation of a divine gift. Through observation of plants, we could inform ourselves how to use them, and as the plants looked like our bodies, thus plants were instructional. And I'm interested in this moment of history where scientific thought and religious logic meet. A century later, we have new scientific instruments that show us inconceivable new truths, such as looking through a microscope. And this is a period of time that seems to enter my work often. But back to the doctrine of signatures, what's more fascinating is that this is an idea that exists in different cultures and different time periods. In this practice of healing, that where a plant grows, how it tastes, its color, its wet, dry, hot, or cold could inform us how to heal ourselves. And it also places the healer both in a place of observation and learned knowledge. While this idea doesn't follow our current scientific thought, I think as it has cultural and humanities significance. It's an idea that often comes up in relation with different religious ideas that can also express or suggest an inherent oneness with the universe, that we're reflected in the universe, and ideas of microcosm and macrocosm. And I want to mention now that this presentation is not intended to offer any medical advice. Okay, so I was looking at historical resources, looking at contemporary writers, contemporary herbalists, and I really enjoyed reading Foucault, and he had a book called The Order of Things that discusses a whole chapter on this work, and I integrated this into my practice. First, I worked with plants that had a strong visual resemblance that might be easy to understand these illustrations. So ginger looks kind of intestinal. Oftentimes we use ginger ale to treat discomfort in the stomach. Cloves kind of have the same similar size and shape as teeth, and ginseng is often used to treat a long life or consideration of a long life. It looks quite bodily. So over time, I've gone to different medicinal shops in cities, like in Chinatowns, and I've collected these little ginseng. And you can see some of them look like a mother and a child, or they have legs and bodies. And so I find these quite fascinating. So I use found objects in my work. I also use sculpture. This is a 3D printed image of the cloves that I've constructed to look like teeth. And I use photography as well. So these are photogravures. And over time, I started to explore ideas that were less visible and thinking about how can I illustrate other ideas as well. So here we have some examples of cancer. And then the work on the right is a cyclamen, which is implying and suggesting birth and women's health in the womb. Let me see where my notes are. And then in the COVID pandemic, I revisited this work of mullein, and I added this pink kind of sense of like a cough or aspiration in creating this work. And this was exhibited in 2022 at the Morgan Conservatory. I became interested in illustrating these doctrine of signature ideas that were less visible and invisible diseases, such as cancer, arthritis, depression, and the lymphatic system. I've been orienting myself to abstracting forms, thinking about pattern, color, repetition. And over time, I think these have taken on more of a spiritual quality in the works and ideas evolving in the works. So I see myself as a storyteller. I see myself as an illustrative artist. I've not been concerned about what the plants actually look like. They tend to bend and twist so that they tell the stories that I want them to. Some of the works have the appearance of scientific illustration, as if to inform you their logic and truth, while later works abandon this for the logic and play of pattern and color and desire to illustrate the invisible. So this is one of the most recent works that's in progress right now about Queen Anne's lace. And in this image, you can see the constellations and the phases of the moon. And the title for this work is The Unknown. So it's again a work about women's health. In my practice, I also explore other themes and mediums. I've been long passionate about folded paper and paper sculptures and artist books. In undergraduate, I was working with paper sculptures of reliquaries and objects. This was my thesis work, and I re-illustrated my thesis work as a lithograph. And the form and the shape of this comes from reference from a work by Red Grooms called Los Aficionados. I was really fascinated with Red Grooms. It was one of the first exhibitions in a museum that I saw. And an artist who was folding paper and constructing and playing with between two-dimensional and three-dimensional space, describing movement, was really fascinating, the sense of humor, but also I discovered lithography and collaboration through that work. And so that was one of the first major exhibitions I saw when I was 18, before I went to art school. In graduate school, I continued to explore book artworks, made lots of inventive works that were never produced. But then I created several artist books that used photogravures and used overlays to continue to tell these stories. In 10 years, over the past 10 years, I focused a lot on lithography and different forms of printmaking. I like to use all types of printmaking, in the vocabulary of my work. But I hadn't worked with artist books for a few years, and I was really drawn and inspired to continue and go back to this work. I'm interested in it because it functions both in two-dimensional, three-dimensional, and four-dimensional directions. It's interactive and playful, and there's potential to invent as well as use existing structures and create entirely new works. In 2022, I received the DeHaan Artist of Distinction Award. This award allowed me to focus my creative practice on artist books for 1 year. My goal was to create 6 artist books, which ended up being a Herculean task. But the award also allowed me to take up residence and work in papermaking and book arts facilities, to take workshops, to acquire equipment and materials. And so it's been really career changing for me, this opportunity. So one of the first works I made was this foxglove piece. I had moved into a new apartment and someone had given me a foxglove as a gift, but I lived on the 2nd floor and I had no garden. And so it's a plant that's quite toxic and you don't want to breathe in the dust from it. So I thought about how could I keep this in my home in the future, which is the origin of this piece. I also have a sewing background. I grew up working in a tailor shop. And so the piece is an invented structure in sewing. Underneath the little bells of the flower, there's a folded disc, and so a lot of the sewing is embedded in that disc, and then the flower is sewn afterwards. That way the structure isn't dependent on the strength being held up with the flower itself. This is one of the first plants that was extensively published for the scientific purpose of the plant. It's a plant that continues to be used in medicine today because it's especially effective. The plant produces digoxin, which is used for heart medication. It's also a plant that's very deadly as well. So you want to be careful with it in your garden. But the doctrine of signatures talks about the rhythm of growth and the small dots suggesting blood cells. And so I imagine this illustration, and it's a reduction print that's printed on letterpress on both sides of the paper. And then the rhythm of the heart is printed on the cover of the box. I imagine creating a series of these. So I created another work. This is a milk thistle. And this is a plant that has a lot of folklore with it associated with the Virgin Mary dripping milk onto the plant. And so the variegation of the leaves and this work is suggesting that it's full of milk. So each of the leaves, you can see the drips of the milk. The drips of the milk are coming out of the box. They're on the base of the work as well. I just have a couple more works to show you, and then I'm going to direct it to my current practice here in the studio. Much of my work has been about experience of travel, visiting museums and collections. And I visited many pharmacy museums and medical museums, and I extensively take photographs. A lot of times these collections become works that then I address 10 years later. As well, in 2013, I visited a pharmacy museum in Poland. And as you traveled through the museum, each floor of the museum was a different period of time or history. And I imagined a carousel book where I could address and create this work. I've been long fascinated with early museums and the idea of the Wunderkammer, and wanted to create a book that was based on this kind of Wunderkammer-esque quality. So as you travel through this book, you have the 17th century pharmacy, and then into the basement, the 19th century pharmacy, going up the stairs, and then into the attic. And in 2019, I visited the Oak Spring Gardens Foundation for artistic research of herbal books and spent time with their gardens. And I created 2 works documenting this experience. The image on the right is a visual narrative of myself in conversation with these books. The works at the bottom were all works that I had not created at the time, but I've shown you some of them. So they've been in my sketchbook for a while. And the very bottom left, there's a little pomegranate that's peeling away. And that's reference to the only other artist that I know of who's made work about this theme, which is Della Porta, which was in the 18th century. On the left then is a garden. So when I was there, I spent time with the librarian walking through the gardens, and he pointed out all the medicinal plants that were in one area of the garden. So I restructured and condensed this garden to create this work. Okay, and this brings to the current project and inspiration for the current project. In 2023, I visited the glass flowers at Harvard. These were flowers I had long heard about. When I worked at Cornell University, I had taken a class and we had looked at teaching collections that the university had, and they had all these Blaschka glass invertebrates that were just set aside. Eventually, they ended up at the Corning Museum, who's been restoring them, and it's an incredible collection. But these were made in the 19th century with lamp working, and they were made because it was difficult to describe, like, what did an invertebrate look like when you take it out of the water? Like, it doesn't hold its form, it doesn't hold its color. So it's an object of scientific analysis. It's an object of beauty, and they were sent around the world on pieces of card to universities, to children's schools, which I think is also really fascinating. So Harvard commissioned them to make these glass flowers. It's a huge collection. There's hundreds of these flowers here. I thought I would find a lot of these herbs that I've been looking at with the Doctrine of Signatures, which I didn't find right away. But I was really impacted by both the beauty, but also these shadows that were created because there were multiple light sources in the room. So first I started creating these relief prints that illustrated these shadows, and I was imagining these as an artist book. So I printed them on translucent paper so you could see the different shadows between. But this idea of the shadows has come up further in my work. So this is a more recent project that was kind of a playful project made for a paper toy box. And so I have these machine cut. I'm using a Cricut cutter. So I screen print and then I cut with the Cricut cutter. I match it up to my screen print. And then I've printed the little shadows of the Venus flytrap on the sides of the box as well. So my current project, I'm thinking too about these shadows that are created with the white paper on white. This is a project that I started in 2022. I attended a workshop at the New York Center for Book Arts with Buzz Spector called Introduction to Book Sculpture. And I was sitting next to someone and he asked us to bring in books to alter. And so I brought this book that like someone had given me that was an herbal and they had passed away. And I realized it was way too sentimental to alter and rip and take this book apart. And so somebody next to me was like taking apart a dictionary from the 19th century. So I started taking his scrap and cutting it into these little paper illustrations and tucking it into the threads of the book. And I imagined, like, what if I were to take all the threads out of this book and re-sew the book with this new information inside? So I tried a couple different models, but I decided like the content ultimately like didn't fit the concept of what I wanted to do. And so I moved to blank paper. I've made a couple models using some twin rocker paper that I had, this beautiful handmade paper. And then I was using a Cricut to cut the cutouts here. So there's like 20 or 25 cutouts in this book. And as I made it, I realized it would be really beautiful if I made it with handmade paper. And the handmade paper had that decal that matched the paper on the edges as well. All right. So here you can see it's kind of some initial play and exploration with the work. And then I made them into SVG files, which is an Illustrator process that then I could scan. I scanned my Sharpie drawings, put it in Illustrator, used the Cricut to cut them out to make these work. So here's some examples of the work that's in the front of the room next to the TV. And some of the pages are these big spreads, and some of them are just individual pages, but you can see how they're interacting with light and working with them. So I have a video now to share with you what I've been doing. I'm going to give you a couple tips on this process as well, if you're interested in making blowouts. So I've made 200 of these over the past 3 weeks, and I've made 200 sheets of paper as well. So it's been a busy couple weeks, but it's a really soft, silky paper pulp that's been processed for 3 hours, which works very well. But you can see I'm using a hose here, and very gently I'm rinsing away. So I have a plastic stencil I've set on top of the pulp, and I'm rinsing away. And you can see I'm holding the plastic stencil down. And the reason for that is that the hose wants to blow away the stencil, so then I lose detail as I'm working. So it's kind of a slow process. Some of these take 5 minutes. Some of these take like 20 minutes to take the plastic off afterwards. Yes, thank you. So in a moment here, you'll see that it's washed off, and then I have a start. I'll show you how I'm taking the plastic off. I ended up using like both a micro spatula and like a pipette or an eyedropper to rinse the material away. Or maybe I can go forward a little bit here. Oops, maybe not. There we go. Okay, so I'm dropping water underneath the stencil to release the stencil. Because the stencil is in the round and it's quite large, like I have to release a couple edges first. Once I've released that area of the stencil, then I can go in from the center and work my way from the center outward. What happens as I'm working with it is you can see how flimsy this is. And I'm trying to set it down on the surface of the paper pulp. But as I'm peeling it away, it wants to fall back down on itself as well. Okay. I've been using a special little mister, and I put a picture up of this for others who might be interested in this process. This produces about 1 gallon of water every minute. So you can see there's a 1 number on here if you're interested in this process. And you can see as I'm pulling it up, it makes this kind of nest of a plastic stencil that's releasing. And you can see there's a little damage, like it has, it's become a little more organic with the process, but I've embraced that as I've worked. And sometimes I go back in and I pulp paint areas where there's been a little bit of loss or the stencil has folded in on itself. So you can see here's a couple examples, and we have some examples around the room. I've included some photographs for those of you who are viewing online today for the process. And you can see some of them are really delicate as well, but I was impressed with how much I could achieve with this paper pulp process. And these are some of the examples around the room. So I have examples of 8 different stencils around the room. I have an example of what this book might look like in its finished form here as well. In the front of the room where it's folded, it'll be sewn into the works will be sewn into the book. I was using about 1 inch or 1.5 inch distance between the holes so that I could catch these different delicate papers in here. And then this is a really delicate one where you can see these little curls on this piece. I'll go in and clean up these works before I bind them into the book. So the next step is to bind these works. I've made enough that I have enough for 6 books. And then I'll have enough that I can make 1 really extensive book that has a lot of extra stencils that allows for experiment and play. And so I'm hoping to continue to be able to experiment with this process and explore this aesthetic that I'm working with as well. A couple other things to mention. I was couching these onto dry pellons, which made a big difference because all the little delicate elements didn't want to stick to a wet pellon. And when I was blotting them dry and then putting them in the dryer, like they stayed on the pellons and then they're removed afterwards. So I'm planning when I create the books to put a little envelope in the back that if pieces fall off of these stencils, they can be tucked away and kept with the books as well, because they'll be fragile and delicate. But I'm imagining that they'll be placed for display rather than being handled regularly in the work. So thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed sharing my process with you. I really want to thank, too, the fabulous team at the Morgan, who have all been warm and welcoming and offering me tips all the way, incredibly helpful. So thank you, Emily, Tom, Ryan, Michelle, Nicole, Liza, Celeste, and Joe, and the interns, and for the community who've all stopped by. Thank you, Jake, for the comfortable home. It's been really wonderful to rest after long days in the studio. And thank you to all my family and friends who've continued your support. So thank you. I'm open for questions.